As I pondered this Sunday's scripture passages, I felt drawn to the question of how they relate to our lives today. Now, on this 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time, I'm sure that you will all agree with me that June has been quite a month. Of course, the pandemic is still with us. And while Canada makes great progress on the vaccine front, we're still not at the finish line, as some like to say. And much of the world has barely started vaccinating. 2 weeks ago, Mark McCormick reminded us that June is Pride Month, when we celebrate diversity and the LGBTQ community. He also noted that June is National Indigenous History Month, including National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st, when we celebrate the heritage, the diverse cultures, and the achievements of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And this past Sunday, the St. Joe's Refugee Outreach Committee called our attention to the June 20th World Refugee Day of the United Nations, which sheds light on the rights, needs, and dreams of refugees. Now, of course, these events occur every year, but it's all too easy to allow them to pass by, scarcely noticing. Caught up in the worries and the demands of our own lives, we may miss their invitation to learn something about the issues faced by the millions upon millions of people included in these groups. And we may equally miss the challenge to consider whether or how we are implicated on those same issues. Consumed by the second year of the COVID pandemic, we might this year have missed these events altogether. But this June was also very different. First, we were caught up in the national mourning for the 215 children discovered in late May in unmarked graves in the Kamloops Indian Residential School. We were told that this discovery should not be surprising and that there would surely be more. And now this week, we learn of 750 more unmarked graves at a residential school in Saskatchewan. The stark reality of 215 children's graves shocked many of us into a new level of consciousness of this dark chapter in our national story. And as a member of St. Joseph's Parish, knowing that the Kamloops school was administered by the Oblates, this made the news feel quite personal to me, and I know to many of you. But how am I acting on this knowledge? On the call for truth and reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people? Then, on June 6th, in London, Ontario, came the hate crime killing of 4 members of a Muslim family out for a Sunday evening walk. The senseless brutality of this event shocked all of us. Londoners gathered in their thousands to mourn, to pray, and to show their solidarity with the family and the Muslim community. At the same time, Canadian Muslim leaders told us that this tragic event was only unusual in its extremity, that vandalizing mosques, threats, and violence are common. Like many of us, I felt challenged to reflect on the depths of anti-Muslim sentiment in Canada, and I asked myself, how am I responding? And now I return to my opening question. How do today's scripture passages help to guide my response to the events of this month and all that they signify? As I try to answer that question, I want to turn for a moment to Julian of Norwich. Now, many of us will know that Julian was a 15th century mystic who spent some 50 years of her adult life living in a single room during the bubonic plague. Julian experienced a series of visions from God as a young woman, and then spent many decades praying and reflecting on these visions and writing about them. When she died, she left a single book written over a lifetime, the first book by a woman in the English language. And this book is the source of our knowledge about her and her visions. What did she see? What did she write? In the midst of the darkness and the death from the bubonic plague, Julian saw God's total goodness. She saw that every human being is totally one with God. In the midst of fear, she saw that God is fully present in every aspect of God's creation. That the beauty shining through a flower, a sunset, or a smile is the beauty of God. She saw that sin causes us to lose sight of God, but that God never loses sight of us. God continues to love every one of us. And this is what we hear in the Book of Wisdom, our first reading. God formed all of us in the image of God's own nature, whether of European extraction, or indigenous, or African, or Asian, we are all formed in the same image. And this must be the starting point, this truth, for the starting point for reconciliation. We are all one, even though we are often blind to that fact and act out of our blindness. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, our second reading, draws out one of the central implications of this oneness. In the letter, Paul exhorts the Corinthians to take up a collection and to send the funds to the Jerusalem church, which is in need. Julian of Norwich saw that God entered fully into our world in order to unite all human beings in the person of Jesus the Christ. Paul saw that as members of his body, we are all called to preserve the dignity of each one by supporting one another whenever there is a need. We hear that same call in modern church teaching, such as Pope Francis' recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. Finally, in the gospel passage, we marvel at the power of God's Spirit as it works through Jesus' healing both the woman with a hemorrhage and the daughter of Jairus. Now, in the society of that time, Jairus was a powerful and influential man, while the woman was poor and a social outcast. They had little in common socially, but they had equal need for God's healing love and mercy. This was enough for Jesus to heal them both. Could they see that? Can I see how much I have in common with my indigenous sisters and brothers, with my Muslim family members, with refugees throughout the world, with those in the LGBT community? Throughout this month, I felt called to pray for greater sensitivity and wisdom to know how to act on my oneness with all the individuals and groups highlighted by the events of June. This week, I invite you to join me, making that prayer your own. Then, as answers become clearer, let us all pray for the courage to act on the sure knowledge that we are all one in the Creator and with the creation. Blessings.